Hello students. Today, we are going to learn about a very important essay called The Study of Poetry, written by Matthew Arnold. This essay is famous in the study of English literature, especially when we study poetry. But first, let's talk a little about who Matthew Arnold was and what poetry means. Matthew Arnold was a poet, critic, and a teacher. He was born in 1822 and lived during the Victorian era. The Victorian era was a time of many changes and new ideas. Matthew Arnold wrote poetry himself, but he is also well known for his ideas on what makes poetry good. He believed poetry should have a very high standard and that it is an important part of culture. In his essay, The Study of Poetry, Matthew Arnold talks about why poetry is so important. He explains what makes poetry valuable, how we should read and judge poetry, and what kinds of poems are truly great. This essay helps readers understand how to appreciate poetry deeply and respect it as an art. Why is poetry important? Arnold believed poetry is one of the most important things in our lives. He thought poetry should not just be a form of entertainment or something we read for fun. Instead, he believed poetry should help us understand life, emotions, and beauty. Arnold even said that poetry is going to replace religion as the main way people learn about morals, truth, and beauty. He thought that, as society changes, poetry would become even more important in teaching us values and connecting us with what is good and true. Arnold believed that poetry can help us think about big questions in life. It can make us feel and experience things that are hard to explain in simple words. For Arnold, great poetry is like a mirror. It reflects deep truths about human nature, feelings, and the world around us. The purpose of the study of poetry. In The Study of Poetry, Matthew Arnold wants to teach us how to recognize great poetry. He wants to help us see the difference between poems that are good and those that are truly great. Arnold is also concerned about how poetry is sometimes misunderstood or not respected as much as it should be. He hopes that people will learn to respect poetry and see its true value. Arnold's main purpose in this essay is to help us learn how to judge poetry. He gives us guidelines or rules for judging if a poem is of high quality. He also shows us examples of good and bad poetry, so we can learn by comparing them. Arnold's method of judging poetry, the Touchstone method. One of the key things Matthew Arnold talks about in his essay, The Study of Poetry, is called the Touchstone method. This is a way to test or judge poetry. The word touchstone means a standard or example that we can compare other things to. For Arnold, certain lines of poetry, written by great poets, act as a touchstone or a perfect example of greatness. Arnold's touchstone method is simple. He believes we should memorize some of the best lines from the greatest poems ever written. Then, when we read a new poem, we can compare it to these lines. If the new poem feels as deep, beautiful, and meaningful as the lines we have memorized, then it is probably a great poem too. But if it doesn't measure up, it may not be as great. Some examples of lines Arnold thought were perfect touchstones come from poets like Homer, Dante, and Shakespeare. For instance, he thought the opening lines of Homer's Iliad were deeply moving and showed the greatness of Homer's poetry. When we read other poems, we can ask ourselves if they make us feel the same way as Homer's lines. If they do, they might also be great. Different types of poetry, high quality versus low quality. Arnold divides poetry into two main categories, high quality and low quality. High quality poetry is timeless. This means it can be read by people from any time and any place, and it will still be meaningful and beautiful. Low quality poetry, on the other hand, might only be interesting or entertaining for a short time, but it doesn't have lasting value. For Arnold, a poem that is high quality gives us a new way of looking at life. It teaches us something important, or it shows us deep emotions in a way we can all relate to. Low quality poetry might be fun to read, but it doesn't have the same depth or importance. Arnold says that only high quality poetry will survive over time. One example he uses is the poetry of Chaucer. Arnold admires Chaucer's work and considers it valuable, but he does not place it in the same category as Homer, Dante, or Shakespeare. While Chaucer's poems are beautiful and charming, Arnold thinks they lack the same deep, moral force as the work of some other poets. The importance of morality and seriousness in poetry. In his essay, The Study of Poetry, Matthew Arnold also believed that great poetry should have a moral message. He didn't mean that all poems have to teach a specific lesson, but he thought that great poetry should be serious. For Arnold, seriousness means that the poem deals with important ideas, such as love, justice, or truth. He thought that the best poems help us become better people by making us think about these ideas. When a poem is serious and moral, it can be inspiring and give us a sense of purpose. It helps us see the beauty in life and motivates us to live a better life. This seriousness in poetry, according to Arnold, is one of the things that makes it valuable and worth reading. Arnold believed that if a poem doesn't have this seriousness, it might be entertaining, but it won't have the same lasting value. He thought poets should aim to write about important topics in a way that connects with readers and speaks to the human spirit. Examples of great poets and why they are great. To help readers understand what makes poetry great, Arnold gives examples of poets he thinks are truly great. These poets include Homer, Dante, and Shakespeare. Arnold admired these poets because their work is full of wisdom, beauty, and deep emotion. Homer was an ancient Greek poet who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. Arnold admired Homer's poetry because it is powerful and exciting, but it also explores deep questions about bravery, friendship, and human nature. Dante was an Italian poet who wrote the Divine Comedy. Arnold liked Dante's work because it is full of moral and spiritual lessons. Dante's poetry shows us the consequences of our actions and helps us understand good and evil. William Shakespeare, an English playwright and poet, wrote many famous plays and sonnets. Arnold admired Shakespeare for his ability to capture every emotion in his poetry. Shakespeare's work is also full of wisdom about life, love, and human nature. Arnold thought these poets were great because they combined beauty and emotion with deep ideas and moral lessons. He believed they set the highest standard for what poetry could be. The difference between classic and modern poetry. The Study of Poetry, by Matthew reveals that the author talks about the difference between classic poetry and modern poetry. Classic poetry, according to Arnold, comes from the ancient world. It is timeless, meaning it is still relevant and powerful even after many years. Arnold believed that classic poetry, like the works of Homer and Dante, is the highest form of poetry because it captures universal truths and emotions that we can still connect with. Modern poetry, on the other hand, is written in a more recent time. Arnold thought that not all modern poetry could reach the same level as the classics. He believed that modern poets should study and learn from the classics so they could try to reach that same level of greatness. Arnold thought that if modern poets understood what made the classics so great, they would be able to write poetry that was also beautiful, serious, and meaningful. Conclusion: why the study of poetry matters. The Study of Poetry, by Matthew Arnold, is important because it teaches us how to appreciate and understand poetry on a deeper level. Arnold believed poetry is a powerful way to connect with life's truths, understand emotions, and learn about human nature. By reading and studying poetry, we can learn to appreciate beauty and understand ourselves better. Poetry helps us think about things like love, bravery, and justice, and it shows us the world through other people's eyes. Arnold's essay encourages us to value poetry and respect it as a way to understand the world. Arnold's ideas are still important today. Even though he wrote this essay in the 19th century, his advice about reading and judging poetry can still help us today. When we read a poem, we can remember to look for beauty, emotion, and seriousness. We can think about whether the poem teaches us something or makes us feel connected to others. In the end, The Study of Poetry, by Matthew Arnold, reminds us that poetry is more than just words on a page. It is a way to explore life, discover beauty, and connect with people and ideas across time and space.